September 15th, 1940, at 11:47 a.m., suspended 22,000 feet above the patchwork fields of Kent, pilot officer Colin Gray locked his sights onto a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The German was oblivious, a perfect silhouette against the haze. Gray's thumb rested on the firing button, his heart hammering against his ribs in the cramped, oil-scented cockpit of his Spitfire. As the distance closed to 300 yards, the Messerschmitt suddenly flipped into a steep vertical dive, a desperate defensive break. Gray slammed the stick forward to follow, feeling the violent negative G-force lift him off his seat. In that split second, the roar of the 1,030-horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine didn't just stutter, it died. The cockpit fell into a terrifying, hollow silence. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Gray watched, helpless, as the German pilot vanished into the clouds. This wasn't a failure of courage, it was a fundamental betrayal by British engineering. Gray landed at Biggin Hill to file his third report of the week, adding to a staggering archive of thousands of documented engine cutouts. The English disease, as the Luftwaffe called it, was a flaw in the SU carburetor. Push the nose down, and the fuel surged up, drowning the engine. While high-ranking generals searched for a complex industrial miracle projected to take until 1943, a small file was redirected to a cluttered desk in a laboratory at Farnborough. It landed in the hands of the only person who didn't care about rank or impossible timelines, Beatrice Schilling. She looked at the data and saw what the men in suits had missed. The Air Ministry was focusing on building a new engine, but Beatrice realized the solution didn't need a factory, it needed a brain. As she began sketching a solution, she made a discovery that chilled her. The ministry was aware that the flaw had already cost the lives of nearly 100 pilots, yet they kept it quiet to maintain public morale. They were protecting a reputation, while Beatrice was about to protect the men.
By the autumn of 1940, the tactical advantage in the skies had shifted into a predatory game of physics. German pilots had decoded the British weakness with lethal precision. Their Messerschmitts used the Daimler-Benz DB601 engine with direct fuel injection, which ignored gravity. A German pilot could roll inverted and slam the stick forward without the engine skipping a beat. They developed the split S escape. When a Spitfire got on their tail, they simply dived. They knew the British pilot faced a choice: let the enemy escape or follow and watch his engine choke. In the cockpit of a Bf-109, the German ace didn't even have to look back. He could hear the silence of a stalled British engine behind him before circling back to execute the helpless Spitfire. It was a psychological siege. British pilots began to hesitate, a flicker of doubt that lasted just long enough to lose the kill. The Air Ministry remained in bureaucratic denial, insisting that the only solution was a total redesign of the fuel system, a project years away. They dismissed pilots' reports as combat stress. However, Luftwaffe intelligence confirmed that the British were losing their best flyers to the simple force of gravity. A secret German memo instructed pilots to force the dive to trigger the British engine cutout. It was a death trap designed by British draftsmen and exploited by German tacticians. But as the Luftwaffe prepared for a final blow, they remained unaware that a woman in a grease-stained jumpsuit at Farnborough had just finished dissecting a captured Daimler-Benz engine. Beatrice Schilling didn't just find the flaw, she found a way to weaponize the very simplicity the Germans relied on. She was preparing to go rogue, convinced that the only way to save the pilots was to bypass the government entirely.
Beatrice Schilling was not the savior the British establishment expected. Born in 1909, she spent her teenage years covered in axle grease. By 14, she had stripped a motorcycle to the bare frame on her bedroom floor. By the mid-1930s, she was a legend, tearing around the Brooklands track at 106 miles per hour. She was one of only 3 women to earn the Gold Star for motorcycle racing. Racing taught her what textbooks couldn't: how engines behave under extreme stress. When she arrived at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, in Farnborough, she was the only female engineer, a distraction to some, but to the pilots, she was the only one who understood why their Merlins were dying. She spent her days with disassembled carburetors, looking for a solution that didn't require a 3-year redesign. In early 1941, Beatrice had an epiphany. If the problem was too much fuel flooding the engine during -G, the solution was a simple restrictor. She machined a small brass disc with a precise hole in the center, 0.157 inches in diameter. This restrictor would allow enough fuel for maximum power, but prevent the surge that drowned the engine. It cost less than £1 to produce. However, the RAE committee called it crude and refused to authorize flight tests. They insisted on months of simulations while pilots died. Beatrice realized that while the ministry was blocking her, the mechanics at the front were desperate. She noticed a series of frantic, unofficial requests from Biggin Hill. She wasn't just fighting the Germans, she was now fighting her own superiors. She decided to take her brass washer directly to the airfields.
By February 1, 1941, Beatrice had transformed her lab into a center of defiance. She knew that during a dive, the fuel in the carburetor revolted, surging upward. Her solution was the .157-inch orifice. It was calibrated to the exact flow rate of a Merlin at full combat power. She personally machined dozens of iterations, testing them against simulated vibrations. The results were perfect. The engine cutouts were reduced to a fraction of a second, too brief to matter in combat. Yet the bureaucrats remained unmoved, demanding formal documentation. They saw her work as an insult to high-theory engineering. But Beatrice was a racer. She knew that in war there is no prize for second place. The tension reached a breaking point when she realized that the official channels were paralyzed by the fear of failure. Every day she spent in the lab, more reports arrived of engine failure casualties. She decided to bypass the rules. She secretly manufactured a batch of restrictors, using her own funds for the high-grade brass. She realized that the Air Ministry's refusal to act was partially due to their commitment to a long-term, expensive contract for a full engine redesign. It was profit over pilots. Beatrice stopped asking for permission. She packed the brass discs into her toolkit, fueled up her Norton motorcycle, and prepared for a journey that could end her career. She was now a saboteur for the side of the angels, heading toward the coast with a solution that was technically illegal, but absolutely necessary.
On March 17, 1941, Beatrice rode her Norton motorcycle to RAF Biggin Hill. In her pocket were 6 brass restrictors. The airfield was a hive of chaos, smelling of fuel and scorched rubber. She found Sergeant Harris, a man who had been maintaining Merlin engines since 1936. Harris had buried too many pilots because of the English disease. When Beatrice showed him the disc, she didn't show him blueprints. She showed him a way to stop the dying. "The ministry is waiting for 1943, she told him. "I'm here to fix it today." Harris didn't ask for papers. He saw in Beatrice a fellow mechanic who spoke the language of steel. Under the shadow of a hangar, away from the officers, they performed a surgical strike on the fuel line of a Spitfire belonging to Al Deere. Harris used his welding kit to secure the restrictor. It was an invisible modification. If the weld failed, the engine would seize, and Deere would fall into the channel, and Beatrice would be responsible. As the Spitfire taxied out, Beatrice stood at the edge of the grass, her hands trembling.
She watched Deer lift off, knowing she had turned a hero into an unwitting test pilot. The twist came as she watched the takeoff. A black staff car arrived at the hangar. It wasn't the police. It was an officer from another base who had heard rumors of the woman with the washer. The underground network of mechanics was already spreading the word. Deer spent 2 hours over the channel while Beatrice waited by the fence. High above, Deer encountered 2 Bf-109s. The Germans performed their split-S dive. In any other mission, Deer would have hesitated. This time, he slammed the throttle forward and followed them into the abyss. He braced for the silence, but the Merlin roared with defiant power. The 0.157-inch restrictor held the fuel steady. Deer closed to 150 yards and shredded the tail of the lead Messerschmitt before the German even realized the English disease had vanished. It was the first time a Spitfire had followed a 109 through a full-power dive. The balance of power had been rewritten by a scrap of brass. When Deer landed, he jumped out of the cockpit grinning. "I don't know what you did to that engine," he shouted, "but I want it done to every aircraft in the wing." Beatrice stayed in the shadows as Harris and Deer huddled over the logs. The success was absolute, but the ministry caught wind of the unauthorized modification. However, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park arrived at the airfield. He had seen the combat reports. He looked at the grease-stained woman and handed her a signed set of blank orders. "The ministry will follow the paperwork," Park said, "but you will follow the front line." He wasn't arresting her. He was giving her a direct mandate to bypass the British government, to save the RAF. Beatrice became a phantom of the front lines. Throughout April 1941, she rode her Norton to 43 fighter stations. From Hornchurch to Tangmere, she lived on black tea and adrenaline. At every stop, she gathered ground crews and demonstrated the installation. The pilots began to call the device Miss Schilling's orifice. The results were devastating for the enemy. The kill-to-loss ratio skyrocketed in less than 30 days. German intelligence was in a state of panicked confusion. Their reports noted that British fighters were no longer breaking off. The tactical advantage the Luftwaffe had relied on for years had evaporated because of a washer that cost less than £1. By May, manuals were edited to remove the section on exploiting British engine failures. But the unexpected twist came when the Air Ministry auditors finally intercepted her. They discovered she had been stealing high-grade brass from other projects to make the restrictors. She had technically committed an act of sabotage against the Crown's industrial plan. However, before they could charge her, a letter arrived from the pilots of 11 Group. They threatened to strike if the lady engineer was touched. The ministry was forced to back down, realizing that Beatrice Schilling was now more popular and more powerful than the generals themselves.
The end of the war brought obscurity for Beatrice. While Miss Schilling's orifice saved thousands of lives, the woman behind it was pushed into the shadows. The ministry, embarrassed by her insurgency, buried the details. Beatrice returned to Farnborough, solving complex problems for the jet age and researching high-altitude flight. Despite her contributions, she never reached the top director positions. She remained the lady engineer in a man's world. She lived out her days racing her vintage Norton, the same machine that had carried her to the front during Britain's darkest hour. She died in 1990, a quiet legend who changed history for the price of a brass washer. The final twist surfaced years after her death. Declassified files showed that her 0.157-inch restrictor was so effective that Rolls-Royce used its data to perfect the fuel injection for the later, more powerful Merlin engines used in the P-51 Mustang and the Lancaster bombers.
Her temporary fix hadn't just saved the Spitfire, it had provided the bridge to the technology that eventually won the air war over Europe. Beatrice Schilling had provided the heart for the Allied victory, even if the world took 50 years to finally say her name. Today, her orifice is taught in engineering schools as the ultimate example of how the simplest solution is often the most heroic.